It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Jeffery Wasserstrom holds a BA from UC Santa Cruz and an MA from Harvard and a PhD from Berkeley. And as a student, also spent a year apiece at the University of London and Shanghai's Fudan University. A former editor of the journal Asian Studies, his most recent books are 8 Juxtapositions, China Through Imperfect Analogies, from Mark Twain to Manchukuo, and the co-authored 3rd edition of the China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know. He is a regular contributor to newspapers, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and magazines such as The Atlantic and Time. He has spoken at literary festivals in Europe and Asia, consulted on documentary films about the Tiananmen protests and the Umbrella Movement, testified before a Congressional Executive Commission on China, and served as a keynote speaker at the State Department organized orientation sessions for China-bound Fulbright students and scholars. Please help me welcome Dr. Jeff Wasserstrom.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be back in Colorado Springs. I've been here before to speak at Colorado College, so I was relieved to hear it was one of the sponsors. And there's a Colorado College tie to China, but I'll save that for the end. I love to speak for audiences like this one that I'm assuming are well-informed people that follow the news but want to find out what's behind the headlines and go deeper into things, and often have traveled to many parts of the world, including, in many cases, Hong Kong. How many of you have been to Hong Kong at some point? Wow. Great. Well, you may be able to understand why this is both a scholarly interest of mine and it becomes an emotional one, because it's a city that I love for a variety of reasons. And it's enmeshed in a convulsive crisis. The most obvious parts of the crisis are what has been in the news with the protests, the police violence, and most recently the vandalism back. But it was actually in a crisis before then that was a simmering crisis that was harder to see. And to understand both the frustration and why the protests are going on, and also the situation beforehand, the most powerful description of this, I came across a Hong Kong writer, Canny Leung, who was translated on this wonderful site called China Heritage that's out of New Zealand. She used the image of a frog in a pot of water that's being brought to a boil. If the water goes at boiling slowly, 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 the frog will adjust and eventually die. If a frog in the pot realizes what's happening, then they'll jump out or they'll try to get out. And she likened the situation in the city to one in which the temperature had been ratcheted up, and that was part of what drove the protests, and the water continues to be turned up higher. So that's one metaphor. The metaphor in this book that that's coming out in February, and there is a postcard on each table that gives information about it, and you can order it. It's already available for pre-order on Amazon. It'll be out as an audiobook, Kindle version as well. But 2 basic themes in that book that I'll just give you sort of the big thesis at the beginning and then talk around some of what's been going on. I think if we imagine historians of the future looking back on Hong Kong in the late 20th century and the early 21st century, 2 things might well surprise them. The first would be that the Communist Party of China, when it took over Hong Kong, when Hong Kong came back to the embrace of the motherland, as it was put in Communist Party propaganda or was handed over, as was viewed in some others, it's surprising how light a touch initially was given. Never had there been a city that had such a different form of economics and also of political life that had become part of a Communist Party-run state and had been allowed to have things happen that couldn't happen in any other part of that Communist Party-run state. So before 1997, when this handover took, there were predictions, and I made a wrong prediction myself, so I'm not saying that only others get predictions wrong, that right after the Communist Party took control, the newspapers would become just like the newspapers in Beijing or Shanghai, and you wouldn't be able to run editorial cartoons mocking the head of the government anymore. But you could in 1998, 99, early 2000s. My wrong prediction, I was a consultant for a documentary film on Tiananmen that was mentioned in that nice introduction just now. And I was at a showing of that film at City University in 1996, a year before the handover. And it was a very moving experience because the students in the audience basically asked me in one way or another, what's going to happen? The film showed the protests of 1989 and showed the massacre on June 4th. And the students basically wanted to know, after 1997, are we going to face tanks in the streets or the equivalent of that if we protest? And I said I couldn't tell. I couldn't make predictions. I said, I'm a historian. We study the past, maybe the present, but not the future. But then I rashly made a mistake. I've tried to teach myself to never make any firm prediction about anything related to China. It continually makes fools out of those who predict, but I was made such a fool. Because I said, and I went on record this, I don't know what will happen after July 1st, 1997, when Hong Kong becomes part of the People's Republic of China. But one thing I do know is there won't be public showings of that film, The Gate of Heavenly Peace, about the June 4th massacre after July 1st, 1997, because that film could not be shown anywhere in the People's Republic of China. In July of 1997, July 1st was the handover. For the entire month of July, the film showed in a local theater. So I was instantly wrong. I'm in good company being wrong about a prediction about Hong Kong. The first really famous wrong prediction about Hong Kong was made in the early 1840s, when Hong Kong was handed over to the British. This is to remind you I am a historian. It's handed over to the British in the Opium War, when the British had defeated the Qing dynasty in the Opium War, and they were frustrated at the lack of ability to trade, to get access to the China market, a recurring frustration and a recurring desire on the part of Western powers. Portugal was the one place that had pretty good access into China at that point because they had Macau, a place near Hong Kong, as their own port. But British traders were limited to Canton and only then in part of the year. So as the victors in the Opium War, they were given a port. And the port they were given was this island that was not terribly significant part of the empire, the Qing Empire at that point. It was called Hong Kong. And Lord Palmerston, when he heard that that was what his chief negotiator got, said, well, he said it very politely, but in the parlance of now, he might have said, thinking of our current situation, bad deal, bad deal. In any case, he wrote a nice letter to the negotiators saying, I can't believe that we're winning the war and you got us Hong Kong, which is a barren island with hardly a house upon it, that will never be a great mart of trade. And basically, you're fired or demoted. So that was the first really, really wrong prediction about Hong Kong. Lord Palmerston thought Hong Kong would never be the equal of Macau or Canton, a great mart of trade. And over time, it became to match them, and as a financial center, far surpassed them. So Hong Kong is surprising in a lot of times. And I said there are two things that historians looking back on this period in history might say were especially surprising. One is how light a touch the Communist Party put on Hong Kong from about 1997 to 2008. And that was partly a period, there were a variety of reasons why there was a light touch. One of the metaphors that was used a lot, you throw out a lot of animal metaphors, I like them, was the boiling frog I mentioned, was the goose that laid the golden egg. So the idea was Hong Kong was economically important. The Communist Party wanted it to still be economically important, and it was a go-between space throughout a long period of history between the People's Republic of China and the outside world. And there were foreign companies there, and they needed to preserve some degree of rule of law and some degree even of freedom of speech and the press and assembly for those companies to not be scared. So the golden goose, they wanted the goose to keep laying golden eggs. So that did protect them. Lord Paddon, Chris Paddon, the last colonial governor of Hong Kong, when he heard that golden goose sign, he said, well, that's a good metaphor, but, history is littered with the carcasses of decapitated geese. But for a while, the golden goose idea did seem to hold true to some extent. But gradually, Hong Kong's economic importance to the People's Republic of China started receding a bit. And there was also a way that the other reason why Hong Kong was allowed to flourish was the world was paying a lot of attention to it. And the Chinese Communist Party cared a lot about how the world saw them as a group, as an organization that could keep its promises. The Chinese Communist Party promised in the agreement with the British that for 50 years things could go on pretty much as they were in Hong Kong, under a structure called one country, two systems. That it would become part of the PRC, and things like international affairs would be done through Beijing, but a lot of local things would be handled locally, and local culture would be respected. The economic system could be different, and to some degree, the political system could be. That was supposed to happen for 50 years. And the idea was that the Chinese Communist Party would be on watch. The world would see if they could keep their promises there. After the massacre in 1989, the deal had been made between Britain and Hong Kong in 1984. Margaret Thatcher had made the deal with Deng Xiaoping. And at the time they made that deal in 1984, when China was promising to have a light touch and promising that Hong Kong could go its own way, that was a time when we had a lot of great hopes for Deng Xiaoping as a reformer, an economic reformer and maybe a political reformer. China seemed to be moving in an opening up direction. But then the massacre happened, and Deng Xiaoping was the person ultimately responsible for sending the troops in. So Margaret Thatcher was on a BBC radio show, and a caller asked, so, are you still confident that your deal will hold up? And she said, that of course it was concerning what had happened, but she did think that the Chinese Communist Party would want to be seen in the forum of world affairs as keeping its word. And so she was, and so after 1997, to some extent, they did. And until about 2008, I've said. But since about 2008, and there were some moves to exert tighter control before that, and some pushback protests, an important protest in 2003, but on a general, until about 2008. But then there were a variety of things that began happening after that. China has become increasingly illiberal at home, across the mainland, and tightening control, and now, especially under Xi Jinping, has somebody who really wants to exert tighter and tighter control over all parts of the country, and that's partly about China. And China has also become less concerned, the Communist Party, for a variety of reasons, about how it looks in that forum of world affairs. Sometimes it cares about it, but the rest of the world, many countries, including our own, have squandered a lot of our moral authority to sort of claim a kind of high ground on many things. And China is simply a richer country, able to throw around its weight more in different ways. So then there's been a tightening. And so the other thing I think might surprise historians looking back is how quickly, to torture this metaphor a little bit, the cook has been turning up the boiling water for the last 5 years. There have been a variety of ratcheting up, some of which the international world hasn't paid that much attention to. It's been a very distracting time. But a key moment was a few years ago when 5 booksellers who were publishing the kinds of books that you can publish in Hong Kong but not on the mainland were spirited across the border to the mainland and coerced into making televised confessions of their guilt because they were publishing books that showed Xi Jinping and other members of the Chinese elite in a negative light. That was one thing. There had been a big protest, the umbrella movement, in 2014, which I was over to witness some of, and it was a very inspiring series of events calling for greater democracy in Hong Kong, and it captured global attention. Afterwards, it didn't succeed in getting universal suffrage. It wanted to have free elections for electing the chief executive, who's the most powerful person in Hong Kong. Under the British, the most powerful person in Hong Kong was the governor, who was appointed by London. Afterwards, it's somebody who's elected, but only about 2,000 Hong Kong people can vote in that election, and then they can only choose between candidates who Beijing thinks is kind of okay. So for a lot of people, it's just one form of colonialism. A distant capital tells you who governs you, has been replaced by a new form of colonialism. The umbrella movement really wanted to change that. It failed to get concessions on that. The next chief executive was handled the same way. But one of the things that people did after this largely nonviolent protest that lasted for weeks was they focused on local elections where there is more of a chance for actual elections. It's stacked so that some of the legislative council will always be pro-Beijing, but there is room for maneuvering. And some young people who got very energized by the political activism of the umbrella movement ran for seats, and some of them got disqualified on technical grounds. And the goalposts keep getting moved. That's another thing that's frustrated people. We want to play by nonviolent rules, but then it keeps not working. And then this year there were very big nonviolent protests at first. They were treated like riots. There was police brutality, and then there started being riots. And so there's been a back and forth in a very difficult situation. So I agreed to write a book about this, about Hong Kong's situation, about the steady decay and some of the things that made Hong Kong special and the pushback about those. I agreed to write that book the beginning of this year, thinking it would be about the umbrella movement and then the kind of tightenings of controls after that and some of the efforts to push back against that tightening of control, but the frustration that came in the wake of that. I agreed to write it for an organization called Columbia Global Reports, which is a set of small books. And again, I think this is the ideal, you're like the imagined readers for these books. Not just mine, but the others. They're short books. They're about 100 pages. They're affordable. Not that I think you're cheap and have short attention spans, but they're for people who want to get the kind of, a quick fix. You're interested in a lot of different parts of the world. So I would like you to read a 500-page book on Hong Kong, but I think that's unlikely. But 100 pages, you can, that's possible. So Columbia Global Reports liked the idea of a book about Hong Kong, and I was going to write it over the course of 2019, and it would come out sometime late in 2020. And then things started, and one of the things I thought I would do was go over on June 4th, when there's a vigil held, a candlelight vigil, in honor of the memory of the victims of the June 4th massacre in Beijing in 1989. This year was going to be the 30th anniversary of that. There's no commemoration possible on the mainland. You can't even talk about the massacre in any kind of public setting. There's a small vigil that's held each year in Macau, which also has a one country, two systems setup. But in Hong Kong every year there's a big vigil. So I thought I would attend that, and my book would end with that moment of those events can still take place, assuming it could still take place. That would show that if you want to say the glass is half full, Hong Kong is still really different from the rest of the mainland. Look at the crowd gathering on June 4th. If you wanted to say, look at the glass half empty, you would say, yes, but there still isn't democracy, yes, and things are tightening in all these different ways. And I could mention more ways. Another way it's tightening is there's a rail station inside Hong Kong where trains from the mainland end up. And security there is governed by mainland laws and mainland security, as opposed to Hong Kong. So Hong Kong's supposed to have a separate rule of law, but at one spot within it, and potentially then over time more spots, it doesn't have rule of law. So I went over for the vigil, and I attended that. And then there was starting to be talk of a new protest wave starting against this extradition law that was seen as another real threat to the rule of law in Hong Kong. And at the end of the vigil, the speakers were saying, and come out on Sunday, we're going to have a big march to show what the Hong Kong people are made of and that they're not going to take these erosions lying down. And that was June 9th it was scheduled for. Unfortunately, my flight was leaving June 7th. But I did get to go to see the vigil, which was exciting. And I got to see one more protest just before I left, which was very interesting. Not one of the giant ones, not one of the rowdy ones you've seen on TV. It was by 3,000 lawyers and other members of the legal profession. It was a silent march in which they all dressed in black. And it was a kind of vigil in its own way about the death or impending death of rule of law in Hong Kong. And then I left. And then on June 9th, the people did turn out who were told to turn out at the vigil, and many more besides. And there was a march of 1 million people. A few days later, There was another demonstration, and there were brutal acts of police violence, and there was also rowdiness. And then the following Sunday, when objecting to police violence became a big part and call for an investigation, an impartial investigation of how the police had behaved, then 2 million, estimated 2 million people turned up on the streets. Maybe even not, if it wasn't quite 2 million, it was close. And we're talking about a place with a population of 7.5 million. So you're talking about more than 1 out of 4 people in this city that, by the way, used to be seen as a city that only cared about shopping and food and was apolitical. When I first went there 30 years ago, that was the way it was described to me, and I thought it was on the mainland where I would see political fermentation. And now it's reversed. When I go to the mainland, it's usually pretty quiet on campuses. On Hong Kong ones, it's rowdy. So I said there were 2 things that would surprise people. One was the lightness of the touch of the Communist Party in the early years. The other was the speed with which tightening began. In doing interviews for this book, it's a history book, a quick history, but it's also largely focused on the very recent past. It includes things that I saw, particularly during the umbrella movement, but also during moments like the Vigil. And I did some interviews. One of the people I got to interview was Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong, appointed by the British, and somebody who still cares passionately about Hong Kong. And he had tried, before the British handed it off, in a very controversial, for different reasons, way, to try to introduce a certain degree of democracy so that whatever was there in 97 would be preserved for 50 years. This can be seen very cynically. The British didn't allow much democracy when it was purely a colony. When they thought they were going to be giving it up, they started to allow more and more of it. But they did have rule of law, and they did have a degree of freedom of press. And Patten, when he was governor, to his credit, did try to introduce more democracy so that whatever was there in 97 would continue. But anyway, I asked Lord Patten, and by the way, I grew up, I grew up in America. My images of what a lord of the realm in Britain is formed largely by period dramas and things. So when I learned that I was going to be able to interview Lord Patten of Barnes, and I went out to this leafy suburb of London, I expected, I rang the doorbell and I expected a butler to come. But Lord Patten himself came and greeted me, and we started having a conversation about novels, and totally upended my view of this. But I did have questions I wanted to ask. So I said, what do you think of my proposition that initially there was such a light touch on Hong Kong, and now lately people would be surprised at how quickly things are changing? And he nodded and he said, when the snow starts to melt, it melts quickly. So, and I also didn't expect, a former bureaucrat to have the most poetic comment that I heard. And it was a perfect comment because metaphors of water run throughout. Hong Kong's name is fragrant harbor, are the 2 characters in it mean that. The umbrella movement was related. You think of an umbrella, you always have an umbrella in Hong Kong because of the rain, but it was used to block tear gas and pepper spray that the police were using, and that became the umbrella movement. And also in Cantonese, which is a very different language than Mandarin, there are ways in which umbrella can also relate to the street that some of the protests were taking place on, and a kind of striking back. There are all kinds of resonances of this, and resonance of with water. During the protests this year, trying to stay ahead of police strategies of brutality and control, the protesters have adopted the idea, and this was said a little bit in 2014, but it's become particularly a mantra now, be water, which is a phrase from an interview that Bruce Lee, the martial arts star and hero who's Hong Kong, has deep ties to Hong Kong, said, and it goes back to Taoist ideas in Chinese of flexibility, moving. If you run into an obstacle one place, you move quickly to another. So water is watery metaphors, fluid ones, run through the book. All right, don't judge a book by its cover, but feel free to judge this one by it. I'm really happy about the designers that Columbia Global Reports work with are wonderful. And this, I'll unpack it I just think it's visually striking. But the Hong Kong flag after 1997 was a red background representing the big Communist Party state and a white flower with white petaled flowers representing Hong Kong and its ability to be different. And this picture shows that white flower being dyed red and dying. So I think it's a very powerful image. I had nothing to do with suggesting it, so I can talk about how great it is. It fits with what some people have been saying since 2014, is the way to think about Hong Kong is it was supposed to be one country, two systems. But then it became more like one country, 1.8 systems, 1.7 systems, 1.3 systems. And the fear is that by the time you get, even before 2047, when the end date for this system comes, it will actually have become one country, one system. So you can't buy Vigil yet. You can pre-order it, and please do. But you can't actually tangibly get a book by me right away. And after my talk, you might want one. So I thought I'd show another cover I'm happy with for this book, China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know, which is available for sale, not here, but on any bookstore or online service. And this one has a cover. It's, I co-wrote it with this edition with Mara Cunningham. And it shows actually a picture of, at the top, suggesting ways that China has been changing and becoming part of the world in ways that would have seemed unimaginable in the 1980s. Certainly, I saw nothing like that was taken at a punk rock concert. Nothing like that was happening in the early 80s, mid 80s, when I first went to China. The bottom part reminds you that some things about the Chinese political system aren't changing. It's still a group of men belonging to the same party, choosing which of them governs. Although it's changed because now the man in the center says that he may just stay there for as long as he wants. But I care a lot about covers, and I like ones that actually convey part of the story about a book. By the way, the what everyone needs to know in the subtitle is not me being like pretentious and pompous. That's what Oxford does for a whole series it has of quick guides to things. It would be called like a guide for dummies or a guide for morons, but it is Oxford University Press. So they wanted to have something that sounded more gravitas. Switching back to the press that I'm doing Vigil with, this is a set of their other recent books and forthcoming ones. And some of them, I think, are exactly the kinds of things that you might want to hear about in the future. They're on things like hate speech control, one called Speech Police. There are others on specific parts of the world. The first one that I read that now I think needs to be updated, was about India and Turkey falling under strongman rule, similarities and differences, written by a Kashmiri journalist who traveled to Turkey, said what reminded him of things of the others. So whenever I give a talk, often they're videotaped and they end up on the web. I want people to always know that the talk that they're hearing, even if I reuse some of the jokes and some of the lines, it was here and it was now. So I wanted to have something that said this week and something that said this place. This place can be challenging. Usually China has a tie to something. When I come to Colorado and speak a general talk about China, I sometimes cheat and say John Denver was one of the first musicians to go to China from America. He played for Deng Xiaoping when Deng Xiaoping came to America. But this isn't a talk about China. I can't use my John Denver go thing. So I did find a Colorado Springs tie-in that I'll tell you in a minute. But why is this happening now is Hong Kong, so I rushed the book through because they wanted to get it out while the story was still in the news. And I wanted to write something that would be out while there was a kind of immediacy to things. So I read it quicker over the summer and into the early fall. And I finished the proof, so I can't touch it now, and updated things. But right after the sort of the last moment I could touch it, and I could, I signed off on it October 2nd, when there had just been one giant protest and the first firing of live ammunition by police who until then had used rubber bullets was. I used that as a cutoff point. And then the NBA story broke. And suddenly, Hong Kong was in the news for a new reason about the NBA, and a sign of how far, this is actually a testing of that idea that Thatcher had, of how China would want to be seen in the forum of the world, and how maybe Hong Kong would have to be left alone because it was so important to international business as a gateway. The NBA story is really a wake-up call to how much of that has changed. And then over the weekend, also just so that it's up to date, there was a new protest on Sunday. There was both new acts of vandalism and new acts of by the police that seemed to call for independent investigation because the police don't admit usually to any wrongdoing. This time they partly apologized, though, because they have a water cannon that sprays blue ink that dyes people so they can then arrest them later, and they sprayed it on a mosque. And so they have apologized for that, where there were not large groups of protesters, but largely only some journalists and a few others. So that's the now part. This is a visual that I just really like, one more water thing. It's an iceberg where you can see some things above the lines and much more below it. The below the line are the things that are like the pressure that's going on people that lead them to act as desperately as the protests, which seem to have no chance of really succeeding in doing what they're calling for. But yet you have to see what's below the iceberg to understand that. This is from the same China Heritage website that I think is so great that had the frog in the pot metaphor. But what about Colorado Springs? What does the Hong Kong story have specifically to do with Colorado Springs, besides the fact that almost everybody in this room has been to Hong Kong? Well, I didn't really realize it until driving in here, but Colorado Springs has a deep tie to the Olympics. The Olympics is a key part of the story. I mentioned that after 2008 is when you've seen China being less responsive to how it seems, how the government seems in the forum of the world. Up until 2008, they wanted the Olympics to go well. There were calls for a boycott of the Olympics because of behavior in Tibet, human rights abuses there, because of Beijing supporting malicious regimes in other parts of the world. The boycott didn't go through, in part because, or didn't have much effect, in part because people still had out a hope because of a kind of possibility for movement toward liberalization. Another thing that happened right after the Olympics was the financial crisis came, and China did fairly well in riding it out compared to other parts of the world. That made for the Communist Party feeling more self-confident and feeling less need to be apologetic and to go slow. There's another Olympics coming up. In 2022, the Winter Olympics will be held outside of Beijing, or right near Beijing. Beijing, which doesn't really get snow, which is kind of a problem of why they had it. But they've created an area near they're going to have it. They don't want a boycott of that as well. There are starting to be calls for a boycott of it because of the grotesque human rights abuses in Xinjiang, the far northwest of China, where hundreds of thousands or a million or more members of the Uyghur ethnic group and others, largely Muslims, have been disappearing into these internment camps, so-called re-education camps, but much more carceral than re-education camps sound like. And some of the people being re-educated, by the way, are university professors and university presidents and poets. So anyway, there's some calls for a boycott already, but if there were, people have often said, what were the chances of there being a massacre in Hong Kong? Well, if there were something like that, there would be much larger calls for a boycott. The other thing about the Olympics, with an Olympic city in mind, is 2008 was a moment when for some people in Hong Kong too, there was actually that possibility of feeling a connectedness to Beijing, a time when, for a moment, the one country, two systems seemed as though it might work. There were even some sporting events held in Hong Kong for the Beijing Olympics. And I know a young activist who, when I was talking about this, he said sort of with wonderment in his mind, because he's now moved to the point where he says, don't think of me as Chinese, you think of me as a Hong Konger. which what it means is it's not denying a kind of ethnic thing. It's saying, I don't accept the idea of being Chinese in the way that Beijing insists all people who are Chinese are a certain way. But he said when he was a kid, he remembered being excited about the Olympics coming to Beijing. It was going to be held in China. People like him were going to be in the hosting country. And there were some events being held in Hong Kong. So the sense of that as a dividing point between how things were working and how they haven't, I think, is powerful. And is something I hadn't thought about as clearly until being here for this. All right, I'll just show you a few images to go with the things I've been saying, because I know you'll have questions. I know I want to hear the questions. And this is, by the way, the very first talk I've given anywhere since the book was done. So it's not the first book launch event, it's the first pre-launch event. So this is a picture I took during the Umbrella Movement, when the streets of central Hong Kong were turned into the closest thing to a utopian space I've ever experienced. A kind of ongoing festival of calling for political change, but also just often celebratory thing where people brought their families there. And there were banners mocking Xi Jinping, doing all kinds of things that you couldn't do on the mainland, but saying we need to protect the fact that we are so different from there. This was something called a Lenin Wall that was in Prague during the Cold War, around the early 1980s. Some people inspired by John Lennon's song Imagine, dreaming of a time beyond the Cold War and dreaming of a time free of authoritarian control, they painted on a wall things honoring John Lennon and his spirit. In Hong Kong in 2014, they decided to create something they called it a Lenin Wall, but they gave it a real Hong Kong twist. Instead of writing on it with spray paint or with anything like that, they put up Post-it notes. Hong Kong, the students all had Post-it notes, and they put out little drawings or little statements about what they felt. And they transformed this concrete wall into a beautiful artistic space. Now I'll give you one final big idea from the book, which you'll see played out there, and you can figure out if it works or not. Hong Kong during the Cold War was a lot like West Berlin. It was a small space of capitalism and markets and entertainment, right perched on the edge of a communist country. John le Carré wrote several of his best books set in West Berlin, where people were listening in on East Berlin. He set one book in Asia, The Honorable Schoolboy, that begins in Hong Kong with people listening in on the mainland. After 1989, West Berlin ways sort of took over East Berlin, and all of Berlin became like West Berlin. After 1997, what would happen? Would Hong Kong, this former West Berlin, become like East Berlin, or would its ways flow into the mainland? It seemed at first like there might be some give or take, but increasingly now, it's becoming East Berlinified, in a sense, more and more like that. And when there's a rail station in Hong Kong that's governed by soldiers of the Chinese military, that's like Checkpoint Charlie being in control of the Stasi. So this is the Lenin Wall. I was there in 2014, saw it beautifully. I came back a couple of years later, and this is what it looked like. And it had post-no bills kind of thing there. Now, if any of you went to West Berlin, East Berlin during the time of that, the west side of the wall that faced toward freedom, was covered with colorful graffiti. The east side of the wall was a blank space that was patrolled and kept free of anything. So to me, that was chilling. There are, though, things. Each time I've gone back to Hong Kong in the last few years, and I don't know, I'm going in December, and we'll see what I feel by that point. But each time I've gone in the last few years, I've been worried, will I see things that show things decaying, that the things that used to be able to be done in Hong Kong no longer can be done? And I've always found something. It can be harder to find books that are different, that challenge the Communist Party. But I also look for things that remind me that Hong Kong still is special and different, and I always find those too. This is the Goddess of Democracy statue. This became one of the emblems of Tiananmen. It can never be displayed anywhere on the mainland, but there is a replica that's on the Chinese University of Hong Kong campus. And And they adorn it in different ways. When there's a gay pride focus, she's dressed in colorful garb. This time she had, a couple of years ago, she had a black and white skirt on it, which had the names of all the political prisoners, people who had been put into prison. So but it's still there. And each time it's there, there's a kind of feeling like this shows the glass half full part. One of the political prisoners who was shown on that skirt, the most famous one, is a guy named Joshua Wong, who's a young man. He's still a young man. He's in his early 20s. He first became famous in Hong Kong in 2012 when he led a protest against efforts to bring mainland-style patriotic education into Hong Kong. So he was 15, and he and some other 15-year-olds, like Agnes Chow, his friend, helped lead a protest that in 2012 led them to stop introducing that new patriotic education. In 2014, protesters do sometimes win in Hong Kong. That's another reason why there are protests, even when they seem hopeless. 2014, he was a leader of the Umbrella Movement. He was then in and out of prison. One of the things I went to this last trip I picked up was a book of his called Unfree Speech, and this was his prison writings. And the cover, one last cover to talk about, is a picture of Joshua Wong, and then you can put him inside or outside of prison, because he's been in and out of prison. It'll be out in English translation about the same time my book comes out. So I like to just not plug my own books, but I'll plug one other there too. But this was a protest that I went to last November, where there had been an art exhibit planned of some political cartoonist who did very challenging art, and it was scuttled at the last minute. Joshua Wong was going to speak there. A couple of members of the Russian group Pussy Riot, who happened to be in town, were going to speak there. It was going to be a celebration of free speech. There were threats made to the family of the cartoonist, and so he canceled the event. So Joshua Wong and the members of Pussy Riot did a pop-up event, a protest, and they just told people by social media, let's all gather to show that they can't shut us up, even if this show couldn't go on. And this was at that event. I happened to be in Hong Kong then, and I went to it. And almost nobody came. So after it, I went up to Joshua Wong, who I'd met twice before, and I said, I just wanted to reintroduce myself. My name's Jeff Wasserstrom, and we've met a couple times before. And he said, "You remember me?" And I was just shocked because I think about him a lot. I've written about him. There was no reason for him to remember me, but of course I would remember him. But that statement haunted me because he had just had this this protest that just hadn't worked, and this protest that had been shut down, and the world seemed to have forgotten about Hong Kong. So the fact that anybody remembered him, I think was quite moving to me. And that actually set me on the road to the book. Now there's no question about Hong Kong being forgotten. The world is paying attention. The problem is it too late? I'll stop then and get questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
You told us that you don't like to predict. Can you do a favor, predict one more time about Hong Kong? What is going to happen according to you?
Excuse me, I don't usually say this for this, but could you tell me where your accent's from, perhaps?
Try to guess.
No.
Я русский из Kazakhstan. I'm Russian from Kazakhstan.
Okay, Russian from Kazakhstan. Okay. So one of the things that the reason why I asked that is because one of the sets of, there were a lot of predictions would there be another Tiananmen? And what that meant when people would say that in the commentary, it was, would tanks roll and would there be a massacre? And there are a lot of reasons why that wouldn't happen in Hong Kong, just for many reasons, including the Chinese Communist Party has tried very hard since 1989 to avoid the kind of powerful images of martyrdom that went with that. But, and there are other reasons as well. But one of the things that people would set up a kind of vision of victory. Would the protests succeed and get all these concessions, or would there be a massacre? As though those were the poles that could happen, and neither actually seemed likely. And one of the places that I think, as a historian, when I've asked to look forward, I look back and I say, what are the analogies that might be useful in thinking about Hong Kong's future? And one of the analogies of the Hong Kong crisis that I found most compelling, or some of them are from the Soviet bloc. The old Soviet bloc at different periods. When there were, and I think of Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong now, as similar to some of the heads of sort of the proxy heads of states that were beholden to Moscow. And sometimes Moscow, like with the Hungarian uprising of 1956, Moscow would send in troops, but sometimes they would say, you handle it on your own, but we're there backing you up if you need it. And the most famous moment that happened, perhaps, or most relevant, would be in Poland in 1981, when Solidarity had very widespread support, the same way the protests have had very widespread support, but there was a crackdown that was done internally. It was done through various forms, including imposing martial law and curfews. I don't know all the details, but that kind of thing. And that seemed a more likely scenario, and Jeffrey Kopstein, a specialist in Soviet and Eastern European studies, and I co-wrote a piece for The Atlantic on that, these different kinds of ways it could go based on Eastern European things. Now you can think of that in a weird way, kind of hopefully, because 8 years after Solidarity was crushed, the leaders in prison, then Solidarity took power through an open election. The thing is that the bouncing back of Solidarity, there had to be a change in Moscow. There was a Gorbachev who made it clear when there were protests in '89 in places like East Germany that he would not back the use of draconian force. But I do think that a movement being pushed underground but not dying, people being in prison but continuing to think about it. And I wrote another piece for The Atlantic where I brought up Joshua Wong's prison letters. Said that Adam Mitnick wrote letters from prison in the mid-1980s when he was imprisoned at the end of the Solidarity thing. He was offered the chance to leave Poland if he just promised that he would be out of prison. He could go out of prison if he left the country. And he said he just couldn't see doing that. And I think that too has something. There are people in Hong Kong that are leaving, but there are people in Hong Kong who won't leave because Hong Kong is not a country, it's not a nation, but people have the same passionate attachment to it that we think of with patriotism. So that's one model of the future. A darker model of the future that some people are talking about that I don't like to contemplate as much is they're thinking about Belfast, and they're thinking about a move toward a different kind of violence. My own sense is that I don't see a short-term or even medium-term happy ending. I don't see a way that this is anything but a tragic and traumatic period going forward. It may well be that there'll be a new modus vivendi where many things can continue. But those are the kind of models I have for thinking through the future. Thanks.
You referred to the police violence, so just curious if there's is the police force autonomous to Hong Kong, or is there some kind of control or infiltration from Beijing?
It's a great question, and it's a very hard question too. The simple way to put it is that the Hong Kong police force was a very highly respected, in many quarters, organization until very recently. It took a hit when there was, in 2014, tear gas used against nonviolent protesters, and it's taken a much bigger hit now. There's been speculation that there may be some members of the mainland, not formal army, but sort of paramilitary forces going in with it. We really don't know. It's quite secretive now. What there has been is collaboration with thugs, with sort of gangster elements who have gone to beat up protesters. There's been an effort very much to not have not have people shot dead. So there have been beanbags shot, rubber bullets, lots and lots of, an amazing amount of tear gas. pepper spray, water cannons, all of these things that have been used. A strange part of the dilemma, though, is one of the things with solidarity, and this is a limit of that model, there were clear leaders that could be arrested. In 2014, there were fairly clear leaders of the umbrella movement who could be pressured and arrested. This movement has largely been leaderless, or as some protesters have said, leaderful, because there's a lot of kind of small groups, collective decision-making, and that both makes it harder to break the movement completely, because you can't just arrest a few people, but it also makes it harder for the movement to negotiate an ending. So that's part of what we're in this cycle for that as well.
I hope. There's a book out a couple years now called The 100-Year Marathon. I don't know if you've read it or not, but China looks at things from 1949 to 2049, and what they envision as their future, including Taiwan, is much different than what we envision in the short term. Your comments on that?
Yeah, okay, more predictions. Well, one thing is, I mean, this isn't so much that it goes there, but what you'll hear sometimes is that Chinese leaders think in long-term things, and we think in short-term. But actually, a lot of the things that the Chinese Communist Party likes to talk sometimes in long-term, but they're actually, a lot of the leaders are actually living on very short-term plans and trying. They have a lot of issues they are trying to ride out in the short run, including a slowing economy, still widespread dislike, a feeling of that the party is riddled with corruption, even though Xi Jinping has launched these very strong anti-corruption campaigns. But actually, the sort of projecting, the talking about this, the long-term goal of things like getting Taiwan, the obsession with the 9-dash line and claiming that these Southeast Asia, these islands are part of the Chinese mainland. Some of this is done, I think, really for the audience that the Chinese Communist Party cares about most is the domestic audience. They've got to keep seeming legitimate in the eyes of that domestic audience. And there are a lot of problems coming up in daily life are still there. So what they're focusing on, the story they tell is, under our watch, China went from being bullied, pushed around, and shrinking in size to being increasingly respected in the world, and if anything, growing in size. So they're really wedded to this idea of projecting strength and global respect. And I think it's put a lot of stock in this idea of being seen externally, but especially being seen internally as a party that's determined to not give an inch and, if anything, grow. And so this is, I mean, there are very rough times ahead between the United States government and the Chinese government. We're already in it, and there are structural reasons why we'll stay in it, regardless of whether the kind of jockeying back and forth and the trade war continues. This is going to be a very difficult time of adjustment. I don't think it's about Chinese dreams of world domination, but it is Chinese Communist Party obsession with being seen once again as clearly the most powerful entity in its region and punching back to what it sees as its natural weight in that area. I hope that helps some.
So obviously you are here to talk about Hong Kong, but I'm also curious because in the last week or so there have also been protests and riots in Santiago and Chile. Do you see those as being connected, and do you think that there will be a future of civil unrest in other countries as well because of this?
That's a great question, and it's a fascinating moment now. And when I mentioned about predictions and not making predictions about China or Hong Kong, being a student of social movements, one of the things that's most striking, I've studied social movements my whole life, my whole adult life. My first my dissertation was on Shanghai protests of the pre-1949 period. And then as I was finishing it, the 1989 protests began in China and in other parts of the world. And as I was filing my dissertation in 1989, in April of 1989, I wasn't saying, and other people weren't saying, this is going to be a year of the biggest year of protests since 1968. These protests surprise. Generations continually surprise. Most of the big youth-led movements, and a lot of these movements are youth-led movements, are the work of generations that are dismissed as being apolitical and unlikely to amount to much right before they explode. And we saw that in the United States just a couple years ago. The Parkland, before the Parkland events and this massive youth march in Washington, people were saying, this generation, you know, they're just on their smartphones all the time, distracted, they don't care about, they're taking selfies, they're not looking outward, and then they did what they did. In 1986, I arrived in Shanghai, and I told people I had worked on the history of youth movements in China. They said, too bad you arrived at a time when this generation just wants to get their hair permed and listen to music and won't amount to anything. And then there were protests in 1986, before I left, the biggest spontaneous protests in a decade. And then 2 years, that was a sort of warm-up to 89, this enormous thing. But there are moments when protests in one place, even if the issues are different, you get ideas about how to protest, you get clues on how to act. The Hong Kong protests in 2014, Hong Kong being a follower then instead of a sort of tone setter. Earlier in 2014 in Taiwan, a place that Hong Kong students were looking to a lot, there had been students who had taken over the legislature, had a occupation of that, protesting against the leaders in Taiwan not taking seriously enough mainland money and other pressure there. The protests in Hong Kong in 2014, the umbrella movement initially was called the Occupy Central Movement. It was around the time of Occupy Wall Street and some other Occupy ones. So there was this idea then of these, you know, of a kind of, you can see it as contagion, or you can see it as sort of like people, it's hard work to get out onto the streets, but people, you know, there's a follower effect. It becomes more possible to imagine things if other people are doing it. Some people in Eastern Europe say it was the protests in '89 in China helped inspire them to take protests. In a rational point of view, you'd say that would encourage you to stay home, because look what happened to the protesters. In the Hong Kong case, it looks like it's going to lose in a pragmatic sense. You could think that would inspire people to go home, stay home, but in another way it says, look at how heroic they are. Look at what they're willing to do for something they care about so passionately. And maybe the risks aren't as high here, so wouldn't I be a fool to not go? So there was Puerto Rico over the summer, the same time as Hong Kong, and there were some parallels you could draw as well as differences, because there's a kind of being too much in the sway of a distant capital, say. There are some, Catalonia right now, because it's an independence movement, has some parallels to Hong Kong. But I think there's also just a way that the repertoire of collective action is something that needs to be refreshed. And if there are new songs, if there are new strategies, one thing that protesters have to fight against is just boredom and tedium. And there's something about excitement. And when other people are protesting other places, that can add to that excitement. So I think 2019 is a year that's going to be remembered as global protest. Ironically, 1919 was too, exactly 100 years before. Those were largely protests across the colonized world that thought World War I was going to bring an end to empires, and it only led to an end to some empires in Europe. And the British Empire continued. There were protests in India. About the same time, there were protests in China. The big movement that I went into this whole field to study was 1919. Protests against parts of China that were controlled by Germany at the end of World War I were given to Japan rather than returned to China, and people took to the streets. And once people take to the streets, they often continue to take to the streets if there's repression to defend the right to protest itself. So that's something we'll likely see in many places simultaneously. But it's a global moment. And even if the Hong Kong protests are a failure locally. They may help inspire people broader. There's a grad student at Irvine where I teach, John Mock, who's from Hong Kong and spent the summer in Hong Kong, and he wrote a piece specifically about this for Index on Censorship, saying that this sort of be water idea, flexible tactics, some of the other things are picking up in different places. Sometimes songs spread. The most interesting song that's sung in Hong Kong, there's some very fascinating locally made ones, but there's also a song from Les Mis, the Broadway musical, Do You Hear the People Sing? But when it's translated into Cantonese, it becomes Have You Spoken Out Yet? So and that to me is a great metaphor, that you're singing the same song, but you're giving it local meaning. It was sung in South Korea during the candlelight movement that succeeded in toppling a corrupt official. So sometimes they win, sometimes they lose, but the tactics and strategies and even sometimes the symbols in the songs can be picked up and become resources.
Jeff, we've got time for one brief question and one brief answer.
Thanks, Guy. Can you characterize for me the attitude that the commercial, financial, and political elites of Hong Kong themselves are expressing towards this protest?
Are they what they're expressing or what they're feeling? Most have, there's one of the really chilling things now is that it looks like Beijing, and this is the NBA story coming back in, Beijing is trying to get people to agree to be silent on certain issues. There is a lot of the feeling in Hong Kong is that many members of the moneyed financial local elite have been hand in glove with Beijing all along. There's a rare case of a tycoon or somebody with links to that who speaks out. There are a few cases of high-profile celebrities who've done this and have been punished economically. Chow Yun-fat, celebrated Hong Kong writer, banned from the mainland because of his support for the umbrella movement before. He said, so I'll make a few million less dollars. Big deal. But that isn't the attitude toward a lot of businesses, a lot of others. I'll just give one example because it allows me to mention the person I never want to go on a talk of Hong Kong without mentioning because I think she's one of the coolest people on the planet. Her name's Denise Howe. She's a canto pop singer, very popular in Hong Kong, also popular across the mainland. Until 2014, when there was tear gas used against protesters, she began speaking out. Her music was banned from streaming services. She was blocked from going on concert tours. She's very varied. I said she's really cool. Not just that. She was also a spokesperson for LGBT rights before 2014. The mainland didn't ban her for that. But she was the voice of Bart Simpson in the Cantonese version of the Simpsons movie. She's an actress. She's also she was a makeup pitch person. She was the face of Lancome L'Oreal Cosmetics in Hong Kong and across the mainland. In 2016, she met with the Dalai Lama. The mainland said she's completely toxic. They told Lancome L'Oreal they had to drop her as a pitch person if they wanted to stay in the mainland market. Lancome L'Oreal dropped her. So it can be a global business story as well as a local one. There was going to be a big concert that they were going to sponsor in Hong Kong in 2016. And she was going to be the headliner. They canceled the concert. She held the concert anyway and turned it into a community concert. She's been very active in the protests as a spokesperson, not a spokesperson for the movement, but somebody trying to explain as somebody a couple of decades older than the people in the early 20s on the streets, what they're passionate about. And she went to Geneva and spoke about the Hong Kong situation to a UN body, was continually interrupted by a Chinese official spokesperson there because she referred to Hong Kong and China as though they were two entities. And she just kept her poise on. So that's a kind of story of variation. But again, this will be a lot of the question of whether it stays an international financial center or not, and what the cost of that's what we still haven't seen yet. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Jeff Wasserstrom. Thank you very much for a tour de force.